The story was absolutely fantastic and quite made me forget my own affair. One of the features of the Book Lover for years had been a kind of agony column, which had originally had some connection with various kinds of literary business. We had sometimes used to read it for amusement, and when I had looked at it in its earlier days, it had seemed to consist mainly of appeals from gentlemen, cultured, traveled, 50-ish, desiring correspondence with ladies who loved books and fireside chat, and women of refinement, conversant with the arts, fond of theater, concert, and opera, who wished to banish ennui by interchange with mature, well-bred men, free from Philistinism and provinciality. But of late years, I was now told by Cy, a new element had been seeping in, and the page was almost as full of advertisements by gentlemen of robust constitution in search of non-prudish ladies responsive to the new dance rhythms, Ganymedes who were at home in French and Italian and enjoyed European travel, watchers by the well of loneliness, and alumni of Dr. Birch's school, as one of those Paris journals that is openly devoted to pimping. And now a terrible thing had happened. The American Purity League, a vice-hunting organization, had recently got wind of this and were about to bring the Book Lover into court for carrying indecent advertisements. "But Jim Milholland couldn't have known what was going on," I exclaimed on my first impulse. "He and that little managing editor and that old lady who went to Holyoke can hardly even be aware that such things exist." "It seems that Jim had been ordering pornographic literature," said Cy with a delighted gleam, "from a man who advertised Curiosa. They found his name in the publisher's books when the Purity League raided the place." I remembered, now that I came to think of it, that Jim had called my attention one day to a volume called Confessions of a Nun, which had been lying on his desk. "Ever see this?" he had asked. They didn't care what they printed in those days, and then had added, as if he were trying to make its presence there look respectable, "It was a phase of the anti-clerical movement before the French Revolution." It now occurred to me that Confessions of a Nun had perhaps been the only book in which I had ever heard him show a real interest. "The most disastrous thing, though," went on Cy, "is that the Purity League sent out a girl to answer the mail ads, and one of them turned out to be Jim. He met the agent in Central Park, and they sat around and talked on a bench. He told her his name was George R. Brown. He made another date with her, and the second time he took her to the movies and rubbed against her knee. The third time he took her to a hideaway in the 50s that it turned out he'd had for some time, and showed her pictures by Aubrey Beardsley." "Stop," I interrupted. "I don't want to hear any more. I suppose he went on to ropes. Poor old Jim. I dare say that his life has been awfully lonely and dreary, while Warren has been having himself a time." "The damaging part of this is that it gives the impression that Jim had been deliberately exploiting the whole thing, whereas he may not, as you say, even have known about it. Unless—" the look of impish humor revivified his pale, puffed-up face, "unless he's entered into a contract with you-know-who to misconduct himself in public." "What do you mean?" I had forgotten Cy's theory. "Why, Jim might have signed an agreement to do evil and make himself notorious so that Warren could keep a clean reputation. You know, that's exactly what happened. That's the way that Warren succeeded in dodging the consequences of that plagiarism scandal. When the forces of darkness cracked down on him and he saw that he couldn't get out of his agreement, he sold Jim to the old black creditor, too. It must have been a 3-year contract, with Flagler still taking the losses and Jim, at the end of that time, paying the price for both himself and Warren, because Warren seems still to be all right. He's probably bought himself some extra years of grace by getting Jim to let himself be damned sooner." "But how would he ever have been able to talk Jim into it?" "He would have told him that the Reader's Circle was a national institution, and a great deal more important than the Book Lover. And he would also have told him that the personals would brighten up his bachelor life, and he would also have misled him by pretending that the devil couldn't really get him. That there was no great risk of exposure because the majority of the readers of the Book Lover wouldn't notice what was going on, and those who did would have no objection. Jim has always had faith in Warren. Warren is the success of the family and rescued Jim from Indiana, where he was a teller in the local bank. He never got to go to college, you know. He does everything that Warren tells him. But then, of course, the devil has seen to it that a big expose shall occur. Of course, the devil runs the Purity League. Would it necessarily be fatal to the book lover? Couldn't they just abolish the personals page and make some sort of explanation? The subscribers out in the sticks never know what's in the New York papers. Well, I've been working on a scheme as I've been lying here to make everything seem all right to the subscribers. There's no reason why the whole scandal can't be perfectly well absorbed and assimilated. What Warren ought to do is to publish one of those deadly symposiums asking various literary men to make statements on the situation. Symposiums are reassuring. The point is that if you propound a question and print enough answers to it, it doesn't matter how absurd or contradictory they are, people somehow get the impression that the problem has been satisfactorily dealt with. I've just been composing some comments for the various poets to make. You could have people guess who they were. It could be a puzzle contest, too, and a symposium combined with a puzzle contest would be irresistible to book lover readers. See if you can guess this one. It's from a poem called Milhollands' Tangent. The more we knew of him, the less we knew. I guessed correctly. Here's another, he said. The embarrassing moment in the empty room. That's very good, I laughed. Though I don't think he'd write those two M's, embarrassing and empty, both. What else? Well, here are some lines by one of the younger men. The doors broken down, the methodical search of the files, the waste baskets captured, the commands against looting sent out. At this moment, Flagler and Jim arrived. They had with them a middle-aged lady whom I had never seen before, and whom I took for some reviewer for the book lover. She was dressed frumpishly in an obsolete fashion, and there was something rather creepy about her. She had hair that showed reddish streaks of dyeing, a hat with a bird's wing on one side, a white chiffon blouse with a cameo at the neck, and a high whalebone collar. And she had kept on an old lank fox boa that was somewhat the worse for the rain. She was pale and uncomfortably tense, but she had put on a blazing layer of rouge, and she kept talking with unnatural vivacity, and laughing in a way that was genteel but irrelevant to the mood of the company. I hope that you agree with me about Byron, she said, while Flagler was working over the fire and getting more material for drinks. We were just discussing the subject on the train. A brilliant man, of course, at moments a great poet. But the one thing that it's impossible to forgive him is what he did to poor little Claire Claremont. One can concede a good deal to genius. I've never found it difficult, for example, to forgive De Quincey for taking opium, and Jean Cocteau, of course, takes opium too, another brilliant man. After all, De Quincey cured himself, didn't he? And that's the great thing. She gave her sharp, out-of-date social laugh. All of us can't be cured, of course, but that's no matter. As I was saying to Mr. Milholland just now, I'm an old correspondent of Mr. Milholland's. We've been writing each other letters for months, but we never met before this afternoon, and I couldn't resist being so forward as to jump on the train with him and come down here. I hope you'll forgive my intrusion, but it isn't every day that one is lucky enough to have a talk with James Milholland. I knew it was he all the time, in spite of his wicked pseudonym, because, archly, I compared the letters I got from Mr. George R. Brown with a letter he'd written a year ago declining so courteously an article I'd sent him. Wasn't that clever of me? When I romped right into the office today and confronted him with the evidence, he couldn't deny the soft impeachment. She laughed as if it were all very delightful. And so we've been having the most enthralling conversation. But to go back to Byron, she laughed again, an apology for her divagation. We must grant the man of genius his privilege of disregarding the social conventions. But Claire Claremont is another matter. I know Claire Claremont. I have seen her and talked with her just as plainly as I'm talking with you now. I've felt her helpless and hopeless love for Byron, just as if she were my own sister. And one thing I can tell you, she smiled in a smug and dictatorial way, she wasn't the least bit in the world like Henry James's picture of her in the Aspirin papers, you know, the aspirin papers I always want to call it. She gave a sharper and less well-bred cackle. Jim Milholland responded with a painful smile. Aspirin was about Henry's speed. I don't often resort to slang, but sometimes it seems the most picturesque way of expressing certain things. Not a drug to stimulate the faculties, but a drug to cure a headache, and let one just go quietly to sleep. Henry wouldn't take opium or coke, oh no. But what were we saying about him? Oh, about the Aspen papers. If you ask me, Henry James was the governess. You mean the turn of the screw, don't you? Suggested Cy. I decidedly mean the Aspen papers, because it's all just the same thing. There's always a governess in Henry James, and Henry James is always the governess. A prudish old man in women's clothes, and in love with the master of the house, and always one of those beautiful English estates. You have a lovely place here, by the way. It reminds me of Mrs. Jack Gardner's. She knew Henry James, intimately, of course. He often used to come to the Palazzo when he revisited the United States, and some say there was something between them, but that I don't believe. I don't think he was capable of passion. She told me that he said to her once, "My dear Isabella," you know how he talked. She described it as ceremonious and groping. "My dear Isabella, in these so charmingly secular, these more than medieval cloisters, one expects any moment to see Fra Angelico pop out with a delightful dinner pail." But after all, admirable writer though Henry James indubitably is, one doesn't want to find oneself deprived of all one's secondary sex characteristics. As I looked at her, I saw that she herself was desexed in the way that the insane sometimes are, so that her feminine features were shrunk to an unfeminine pinchedness and dryness. She was holding us, I realized now, by the spell that the lunatic is able to impose, sweeping one along with a furious force that has no natural origin or object. We had at first tried to reply to the things she said, but had ended by sitting silent. Jim Milholland was meek in a Morris chair that was a part of the 1900 interior, with both his arms stretched out along its flat arms. I noted the cleanness of his cuffs and his long, knotty rural fingers. Presently he shifted his hands and held them above his vest, with the fingers interlocking and his elbows on the arms of the chair. His gaze behind his glasses was dull, and his dog-like jowls were drooping. His eyes and his wide mouth betrayed withdrawal and worry. I felt for the first time a certain mild sympathy for his cuffs with their simple gold cufflinks, his steel spectacles, which gave to his face a suggestion of professional austerity, and his not badly selected plaid tie, worn with a soft shirt that buttoned down. Yes, he had risen above the bank-teller class. "And that," the crazy woman was saying, "is the reason why I'm utterly convinced that William James did come back from the other world and dictate to Alfred North Whitehead. Alfred Whitehead had never written philosophy before. He'd just been a mathematician." Flagler dropped a log on the fire and ripped through the skein of her talk. "I'm sorry it's so cold," he said. "It gets colder in the lower circles," said Cy Banks aside to me, and his remark started a train of thought which presently led me to reflect that if Jim Milholland's hour had sounded, Flagler must be due for a release, a conclusion which did not at first seem confirmed by the scene that I overheard when, in my need to escape the visitor, I had broken away from the company and was going upstairs to the toilet. Flagler, too, had gone upstairs for some purpose, and though I caught only a snatch of the interchange as I was on my way through the hall, I realized that it belonged to the climax of a drama that had long been building. From the half-open door of a bedroom, I heard Lydia's clear, quick voice ringing out in a humorous and impudent way that it seemed to me would provoke me to kill her. "We were just bundling, Flag, just talking about the harvest and the husking bee. Brian came in here to get bromo-seltzer." And Brian's yelping tenor, "Well, really, I must say, Flagler, that if you insist on living in an igloo, you oughtn't to be surprised if your guests double up." It seemed odd, as I thought about it in the bathroom, that Flagler should answer quietly, "Come downstairs. There's somebody here I want you to meet." And soon after I returned to the study, Lydia and Brian appeared, both of them flushed and rather subdued. Brian's habit, on seeing new people, had always been to shrink away and skulk on the fringe of the company, from which he would harass the conversation with heckling challenges and insulting asides, and presently engage in a counter-conversation with someone who was sitting near him, a performance of which the derisive hoots and the constantly increasing loudness would soon hamper the other talkers and eventually give Brian the center of the stage. But now Flagler put his hand on Brian's shoulder in the friendliest and easiest way and propelled him toward the lunatic book lover. "I want you to meet Mrs. So-and-so," he said, with, for him, rather unusual discourtesy, "who is unquestionably one of your fans. This is Mr. Brian Sykes, a greater poet than Byron and a greater Don Juan than Henry James, to paraphrase Houseman on a famous occasion. I'm sure you know the story." A.E. Houseman: "There's an enigma. A very strange man," she cried. "I presume you mean A.E. and not D.H. There's something distinctly strange about that affair with Gerard Manley Hopkins. Those letters they wrote one another, they sound like two lovers, and then Houseman not publishing Hopkins' poems. But of course there's something strange about all of us, if the truth were only known." She laughed. Jim shifted the position of his hands again and pulled his legs in as if somebody were taking a swing at him, and I was trying to collect myself to switch her away from this subject when she suddenly turned on Cy. "You stutter, I notice," she said, as he stared at her, doped and dumb. "Whenever I hear a stutter, I know there's a psychic defect. I don't mean to be invidious, of course. All great literature grows out of defects, like Somerset Maugham's club foot. And that's where your sprung rhythm comes in. Didn't Hopkins have a stutter? There's something that's frightening in all of us, if you ask me. The whole world is frightened. It's frightened of going insane. And what have we got but the great writers? Though even Thomas Mann nods." "The Joseph series is one big snore," put in Brian, who was enjoying the visitor, and who was always delighted at a pretext for belittling a distinguished contemporary. "Well," declared Flagler emphatically, knocking out his pipe on the mantel, "if the writers are the only thing that stands between us and the complete Untergang des Abendlandes, and I'm not sure you're not right, we might as well give up the whole game." He had just made himself a drink and was standing in front of the fireplace, rather round-shouldered, as he always was, and with his usual somber look that contrasted with his neat brown tweed clothes. But his voice, as he went on, had a resilience, and his tone a self-assurance that surprised us and commanded our attention. "Personally, I'm absolutely sick of the whole damned literary racket. When you come right down to it, what is it but huckstering in a lot of greasy daydreams? You take fantasies that people have made up because they can't travel as much as they want to, or haven't got anybody to sleep with, and you get them set up by a printer and bound between two board covers, and you organize a business to distribute them. You hire space for advertising to tell people that if they'll part with $3.50, they can befuddle themselves with this fantasy. The fact that it's spelled out on paper makes them almost think it's real. And the same thing is true of the big reputations. What was Byron but a fat, neurotic man who suffered from a deformed foot, but had happened to inherit a title and some money? He didn't really care much about women, but he'd succeeded in exploiting his ideas of what his emotions ought to be like, till the women would actually swoon if he so much as came into a room. Our visitor here is still steamed up about him, and Brian, in a more local way, is in the same situation as Byron. He sells the public little syncopated pipe dreams about himself in bed with beautiful girls. People have to solve crossword puzzles in order to be able to get in on them, and for some reason this makes the highbrows feel all right about indulging themselves. And for some reason equally cockeyed, this literary pandering gives Brian such a conviction of innate superiority that he thinks he doesn't have to have any manners or even any ordinary decency. Brian had turned red and intent, but did not make any reply. "And so I say to hell with it," Flagler went on. "The whole thing becomes repulsive. There's going to be a great stink raised now about the pimping personals in the book lover. But actually, these Swedish masseuses and things are about the most respectable wares that the book lover has ever advertised. They at least give some tangible satisfaction instead of just teasing the imagination. So I'm done with imagination titilators. I might as well announce to you folks, in case you didn't already know it, that Haynes and Kendall is about to be liquidated. I'm going to sell the whole thing to McManus. And do you know what I'm going to do with the proceeds? I'm going to buy a dandy little sailboat, because sailing's always been the only thing in the world that really made me perfectly happy. It keeps you away from books, and it keeps you away from women. I'm going to be out sailing all summer, and in the winter I'm going to spend my time just sitting around the Yale Club bar with red-faced old grads who like boats. "Bravo, Flagler," said Brian Sykes in his offensive way. "That's the greatest dramatic speech I've heard since I saw Walter Hampton play Shylock. That picture of you as a rollicking old boat lover is one of the most splendid things of its kind since Franz Hals did his carousing boors." Flagler looked at his watch. "And now, Mrs. Hooses," he said, paying no attention to Brian's jeers, "you have just time to catch the 5:25, which will get you into town for a late-ish dinner. And you're taking that, too, aren't you, old chap?" He turned amiably but firmly to Brian. "You'd better get your things packed or you'll miss it." Brian said, "I see," and left the room. Lydia burst into tears and immediately phoned for a taxi. Cy Banks sat solemn and stunned. Even Mrs. Hooses seemed daunted. She offered me a Benzedrine tablet and swallowed a couple herself. At this moment the doorbell rang. It was the plumber to attend to the heating. Jim Milholland stayed overnight, and Flagler drove him to the station the next evening. But poor Jim did not get on the train. He took a room at a local hotel and shot himself that night with a revolver that he had brought with him from New York. He had written a note to the management expressing his regret at inconveniencing them, requesting them to notify Flagler, and enclosing the price of the room and a moderate tip for whoever should clean up. He had carefully packed his clothes, dressed himself in a suit of pajamas, spread out the Sunday paper on the bathroom floor — he had bought it in the lobby for the purpose — lain down on it exactly in the middle, and put the revolver to his heart, which, though less certain than shooting in the head, he must have preferred as less messy for other people than spattering his brains about. As Warren said, Jim was a gentleman to the end. "I have lost," he wrote in the Book Lover, "not merely a brother, but a colleague, with whom a close association of many years never ceased to be stimulating and helpful. He was one of the staunchest and rarest souls that it has ever been my privilege to know. Ave atque vale, frater." Part 4. Yet Lydia, as Cy later told me, did a lot of explaining and made her peace with Flagler in a tearful telephone call. Flagler did not sell his business, but went into bankruptcy, and never bought his sailboat. Warren put him in as editor of the Book Lover, which now dropped the personals department, and got out several special numbers devoted to educational publications and symposiums on large general questions. But the paper did not prosper, and was allowed by Warren to ebb away till there was little to be found in it, save puzzles and reviews by the provincial school teachers who made up most of the surviving subscribers, and whose interest was encouraged by this means. Warren, I remarked to Cy, must have signed with the black man a very long-term contract, longer than poor Jim would appear to be worth, especially now that he'd been collected. "Oh, he's signed a new agreement," said Cy. "He's given him some kind of lien on Spike. Haven't you noticed lately?" It was true that Spike Milholland had changed very much since the days when I had first met him at Warren's, not yet out of college, very left and full of his idea of scattering poems from planes. After a year or two of unpaid work on a small, non-Marxist radical monthly, he had, through Warren, got a job doing a book column on one of the morning papers, and had achieved, toward the end of the 30s, when serious literary journalism was sinking extremely low, a considerable reputation and following. This had led to a radio engagement to broadcast 10-minute reviews of new books, and here he had scored a prodigious success. It was curious to see how easily the impudence with which at college he had challenged the English department by publishing in his rebel paper an article called William Wordsworth Renegade, and his gift for the kind of wit which the 20s had called wisecracking, were now diverted from their original objective of revolution the American way, to quote the slogan of his Left magazine, and splattered in a meaningless commentary on the products of the publishing season, which, keeping up in its earlier phases some of the appearances of a social slant, soon relaxed into almost perfect harmony with the views of the publishing trade. On the radio and in his column, he had now, to all intents and purposes, subsided into the role of the salesman who tells you in a menswear shop that he can show you some fine silk shirts, or that if you don't care for anything in silk, he can give you something nice in rayon. If you did not want a pretty good novel, he could recommend a crisp new detective story. But his fast tempo and his boyish manner, his indefatigably resourceful wit, won him a special kind of standing as a promotion man, and earned him a gigantic salary. I met him one day during the war at a party that had been given by the publisher of my book on 19th century painting for a man who had written a novel about the crew of a bombing plane, and I was struck by the streamlined model adapted to the needs of a new era which Spike had succeeded in developing out of the standard Milholland personality. He had kept his upstanding hair and the grin that carried off his insolence, but I could see that these were now being exploited as part of a deliberate performance. He had not, however, lost entirely his capacity for passionate feeling. He was excited about World War II to a degree that I recognized from the previous one as only possible for a civilian non-combatant. He was married and had 2 children, so he was exempted from military service, but he took a vicarious interest in the bombing of German cities that had almost become an obsession. He had done a little flying in his college years, and he now haunted aviators and airfields. Berlin had just been partly wiped out when I saw him again at this party, and he told me that he considered that the pilots of those planes had done more for literature than any goddamn novelist or poet who had been writing during the last 20 years. He had complained in his earlier phase about what he called the betrayal of his generation by writers like Eliot and Pound, whom he had at one time enthusiastically imitated, and it now seemed that this generation had also been treacherously betrayed by the Marxists, whom he had admired later. His indignation at the thought of the fatuity of those who had believed in the historic role of labor in the face of the menace of fascism now almost reached the pitch of hysteria. In the meantime, the book clubs had been multiplying and becoming more and more shameless, and Spike had been cashing in on these too. He was the principal name on a committee of selection for a scheme called the Treasure Seekers, which represented a bold variation on the original book club idea. How would you like, their advertisements demanded, to have the foremost critics in America, with their expert knowledge, their mellow wisdom, and their infectious and gargantuan gusto, come into your home and talk to you of the books they have loved and prized? How would you like to have them send you every month the literary finds they have made? These lovers of reading have spent their lives appraising and enjoying books, and they know that the books most worthwhile, the books that we keep and read again and again, are not always the much-publicized bestsellers on which we sometimes find that we have wasted our time. They are books that may have passed unnoticed at the time of their publication, books that a big crime or a war that absorbed your attention at the moment when you were reading your morning paper may have prevented you from knowing about. Or they are books which may have been put in the shade by other books of a similar character which appeared at the same time, but which are deserving of a permanent place in every book lover's library. Spike Milholland and the experts who assist him have sailed all the seas of literature, and they have delved in its remotest lands like the seekers after buried treasure. Their joy when they find a good book is like the thrill of the romantic adventurer when he spies the gleam of Spanish gold. And they want to share this joy of discovery not merely with one another, but with every man and woman in America who knows and loves good reading. This disparagement of current bestsellers, this enthusiasm for neglected merit, might have appeared rather surprising in a Milholland if one had not known that, as Cy informed me, The jubilant discoveries of the treasure seekers were simply more or less recent books that had not sold when they first came out, so that the publishers found themselves with embarrassingly large stocks on their hands. Instead of remaindering them in the usual way, they had hit upon the brilliant expedient of unloading them through a special kind of book club. This, in some cases, led Spike, to be sure, into a certain inconsistency as a critic, since the books that he was now rescuing from oblivion, with an excitement he was wild to communicate, were sometimes precisely the books that, as a reviewer in his daily column, he had condemned or dismissed or ignored. But no one seemed to notice this. At the same time, in a different quarter, far from vindicating the sounder values, he was involved in a project for gauging the coarseness of the coarser public appetite and providing it with a diet made to order for it. Spike was one of the advisors to a conspicuous firm who had achieved an immense success by scrapping completely the old-fashioned inhibitions which made publishers still want to appear gentlemanly or to enjoy the public prestige of being supposed to represent good taste, and by frankly setting out to sell books in a similar spirit and by similar methods to those of the circus promoter or the patent medicine vendor of 75 years before. It was strange that it had taken this spirit so long to get into the publishing business, but now that it was there, it was plunging ahead with an exuberance of exploitation so heady as to be irresistible even to Spike Milholland, who had somehow hitherto succeeded in regarding himself as a popularizer of things worth popularizing, a barker for a Parnassus, as he said. The new plan was to take a poll of what the public liked most to read in those sections of the country where bookstores were scarcely known or missed, and to get the kind of thing manufactured that would appeal to this half-literate public. The products would be marketed through the mail-order catalog of a colossal Middle Western department store, which was the only periodical that was known to reach large numbers of these people. They could thus order standard books at the same time they ordered standard furniture, or farming tools, or children's clothes. This was a great deal more profitable than the treasure seekers, which had not turned out tremendously well, and Spike got his cut for suggestions as to the kind of thing that could be supplied to these layers of the population to which the reader's circle was not able to penetrate. A certain slight tension of rivalry began to be felt between Warren and Spike. Both of the two surviving Milhollands now showed in their personalities the peculiar effects of power. Warren's face had grown solemn and set, and he was like one of those steel company officials who give you the impression of being owned and driven by an organism bigger than themselves, which makes them feel their strength and importance, yet keeps them anxious and never leaves them free. Spike was like a man who had made good in the publicity department of a big motor company, as I had seen them with my father in Detroit. He was friendly, frank-spoken, full of jokes, and yet somehow slightly menacing and unpleasant, because he could not help giving the impression that he was a part of something oiled and metallic that was running at terrific speed, and with which one could no more monkey than with the old-fashioned proverbial buzzsaw. One felt this more and more after the end of the war, when Spike had no longer any cause to grow fervent or furious about. At the same time that, with restrictions on paper removed, the book industry was pounding full blast. This industry now played directly into the hands of the moving picture producers, who had swallowed up the theater in the 30s and by the mid-40s were making great inroads not only into the field of fiction, but even into those of biography and history. It had always been the habit of literature to fall back on stock characters and stock situations, but in the traditional fables of stories and plays, there had usually been a certain consistency. A villain, a virtuous woman, a tragic romantic hero could be counted on to keep up their roles in accordance with accepted conventions. But Hollywood had by this time discovered that the shadows that were printed on films did not need even this simple continuity. The choppy sequences flew by so fast, they faded from the screen so completely, that the audiences could be made content by merely being allowed to sit in a darkened and perhaps air-cooled house, Watching backgrounds displace one another and human figures shift back and forth, while the soundtrack paid out a kind of dialogue, which was similar to that of the balloons in the mouths of the characters in comic strips. No logic, no firmness of outline of even the most elementary sort were required at this stage of the films, and these qualities were beginning to vanish also everywhere else in our writing. The Milhollands were dealing more and more with the simple commercial processing of words for the purpose of lulling this audience with blurry feelings and flimsy images, and their scruples about ballyhooing bad writing had pretty well been destroyed by the influence of the monotonous superlatives that were plastered on movie previews. It was queer at this time to see Spike, who must still have been sustaining himself with the belief that he was loyal to the best, confronted by the writers who had emerged from the services at the end of World War II and were trying to do serious work. He patronized them, rebuked them, passed them over. It troubled him when he knew they were good, for whatever his real instinct told him, his whole energy, his whole equipment were now unconvertibly adapted to interesting the public in something else. What this was very soon to be made manifest in a way that was almost apocalyptic. One day, when I had come down to the village, I ran into Cy Banks on 8th Street. I had undertaken to do for my publisher, who was following the current fashion of celebrating the national culture, a short history of American painting. And I was going to see some American primitives that were on show at the Whitney Museum. I had not seen Cy for several years, and I was depressed to find him shabby and unshaven, almost to the point of beggary. His hands quivered and his speech faltered, and there were sometimes long, embarrassing intervals during which, unable to manage a word, he could only make smacking sounds. I thought he must have been drinking a lot. He first asked me for a cigarette, then, as we walked along the street together, tried to touch me for $10 to pay his rent. I had only $2 bills, but felt guilty at not being able to help him. I was afraid that he did not believe me, and when he asked me to stop in at the cruller shop, where he said he was meeting Flagler, I went with him to prove to myself and to him that my friendliness was not affected. Yet I dreaded this session in the cruller shop. What I shrank from, I think, was close contact with the underside of Milholland success. The cruller shop was a flavorless place that combined being clean and well-managed with exploitation of the Greenwich Village tradition. There were mediocre paintings by known artists on the walls, and framed poems by poets of the 20s, none of which had been, as was sometimes the case in the older bohemian cafes, presented to the management as payment in kind, but all of which had been specially procured for the purpose of creating glamour. Yet what was left in that part of town of the artistic and literary population still tended to go for drinks to the cruller shop, where it mingled with the ordinary apartment dwellers and the visitors from out of town, and was almost indistinguishable from them. I had one day had lunch there with an artist who had done admirable satirical drawings in the Communist magazine, and I felt almost have been lunching in one of those uptown hotels to which publishers and editors take you. We found Flagler there, sitting at a table alone, and he too seemed in rather wretched shape. He looked more saturnine and dampened than ever. His wide mouth was drawn down at the corners, his spectacled green eyes were diminished to slits, and the nostrils of his inadequately salient nose seemed cavernous and dark like a death's head. He had always, through his publishing adventures, kept up in his dress, talk, and manner a certain masculine raciness and snappiness that somewhat counterbalanced his funereal aspects. But I felt now for the first time, with a certain distress, that he had definitely passed into decline. The book lover had been finally converted into a sort of bi-weekly publicity sheet distributed by the Reader's Circle, and Flagler had been removed from the editorship as too literary and not businesslike enough. For 2 years he had been making a living rather ignobly, and with no margin for luxury, as a publisher's reader and reviewer. I did not then, however, know this. and I asked Flagler what he was doing. "Nothing much. I've just finished a job of research for Freddie Pratt's novel. It's one of those long historical rigmaroles," he explained in reply to my question, "that takes typical American characters through every goddamn war and national event from the Revolution on. Is it going to be any good? It ought to be. It's got all the best battle scenes that have ever been written in this country. Cooper, George W. Cable, Ambrose Bierce, Stephen Crane, Thomas Boyd. How are the in-between periods handled? Lydia did most of that part. She's always had a gift for free fantasy, but she hasn't been able to write. And now all that she's had to do has been to spin herself some wonderful daydreams and to let Freddie put them into sentences, if you can call what he writes sentences." "5 generations of marvelous women," said Cy, coming to life with his drink, "with every other generation as Cinderella. And they're like Lydia. They're always having a struggle between their careers and the men they love. And there are 2 of everything. That's the great selling point. There are 2 American families, not just one. It's like the old Traveling Tom shows. Don't you remember how they always used to advertise 2 Topsies and 2 Simon Legrees? But what's the point of the 2 families in the story? Why, one in the north and one in the south. There was Lydia Boudinot, who went to France and became the American Rosa Bonheur, and there was Lydia Gaylord, who ran the plantation and kept the carpetbaggers at bay after her menfolks had been killed in the war. And finally, there was the Lydia Boudinot who lived with a Czechoslovak labor leader and later became a wave and married Lord Louis Mountbatten. What did Pratt himself contribute besides the prose? Isn't that enough?" twinkled Cy. 900 pages of typing that are less trouble to read than a road sign." "Fred did contribute something," said Flagler. "He contributed the great natural disasters, the droughts, the cyclones, the floods. He's a trained meteorologist, you know." "He used to do the weather reports," Cy explained, "on one of the morning papers. I tell you, this book has got everything. They even called me in to inject a good shot of pornography." "McManus," Flagler continued, "is putting on the biggest promotion campaign that's ever been seen in this country. They're taking double spreads in the papers and claiming an advance sale of 300,000 copies. Of course, it's a complete fake. That many copies haven't even been printed. They sell them on paper to their own warehouses. They have branches in all the big cities. There's no actual demand for the book. But even if it gets bad reviews, it won't make a bit of difference. They'll put it over as a big bestseller, whether anybody wants to read it or not. That's what the publishing business has gotten to be. Then a cheap edition in paper that will sell a couple of millions. It was true, as I had been brought to recognize in discussing my own new book with McManus, that the market for cheap paper-bound reprints, susceptible of being sold by the million, was exerting a new kind of pressure on even the long-established publishers in their ordering and selection of books. I had found, for example, that when I proposed to McManus a new life of Thomas Eakins, they had asked me to do instead a short survey of American painting that could be disposed of more easily in the drugstores, the cigar stores, and the railroad stations. At this moment in our conversation, with its slow drinks and its morose humor, we were jarringly invaded by Lydia, who sailed down on us like a svelte gray seabird that alights with short, eager shrieks and a spasmodic flapping of wings. I had never seen her so well-dressed before, nor playing with so much assurance the role of woman of the world. She had evidently just had a facial. The cold, creamy smoothness of her complexion seemed hardly to be creased by her grin, and her hair, which had been done in scrolls, seemed to have taken on a deeper yellow, like fine-spun molasses taffy. "I can't stay a minute," she said, pulling off her paler gray gloves, which were also very new and smooth. "I promised to go to Spike's. He wants to sort of rehearse his speech, and he wants Freddie and me to be there. An old-fashioned without the sugar. Without the sugar, mind. Well, how are all you children?" She smiled upon us gleefully, with a self-conscious sweetness. "Me, I'm in a dither. I've just been to Brooks with Freddie, helping him buy a suit. Did you know that Connie always bought his clothes for him all the years he was married to her? That's the reason he always looked that way. I saw to it that he got a good cheviot, something like one you used to have, Flag. He's going to be transformed, you'll see. But I can't do anything in time for tonight about his old 1920 evening clothes. They go back to the days of stiff shirt fronts. I gradually became aware that the great cause of Lydia's excitement was an occasion which I had read of in the papers, but to which I had hardly paid attention. That evening, the first program was to be broadcast of the nationwide television hookup, and Spike was to appear on this program and talk about the Frederick Pratt novel, which was to be distributed by the Reader's Circle, and which had been saved for publication that day. "Would you mind very much, Flag," asked Lydia, "if I went with Freddie instead? His daughter was going to go with him, but she had to get back to school a day early, and he says he won't go alone, and that there's nobody he'd be willing to ask. You know how shy he is. He's just like a great big kid on the verge of his first dance. I offered to take him and rally round him, poor lamb. I thought you wouldn't mind." She smiled in the gay, good-natured way that meant she hoped she was giving him pain. "Go ahead," replied Flagler, impassive. "Oh, good news, by the way," she went on, as if she had been saving this to make him feel better. "Spike has talked to Firstman Fraser, and they're going to come through with a couple of grand, one for me and one for you. He told them that if Freddie had had to go to work and do all the research himself, it would have taken him 6 months longer, and he says that seemed to impress them. I told him that if it hadn't been for me, the book would never have been written at all, because I had given Freddie all the love interest." She smiled her smug, ecstatic smile. "What about all those bedroom scenes I warmed up?" demanded Cy. "And after all, I was the person who suggested the whole idea of having Nancy Gaylord be the mother of Walt Whitman's illegitimate child. It's terrific," he said, turning to me. "He meets her at the Mardi Gras and lays her on a cotton bale. She realizes then for the first time that the Yankees aren't all as bad as she'd thought." "I put in that touch," said Lydia. "Well, I'll try to get you something, too. And now, chickadees, I must fly. I told Freddie that I'd inspect him before he went out. It's awfully good of you not to mind, old thing." As she got up, she squeezed Flagler's forearm. "He really needs somebody to hold his hand." She smiled convulsively again and left. "I've got a feeling," said Flagler, finishing the dregs of his drink, "that I'm going to skip the whole thing. It's bad enough to have to hear Spike put out his literary jive on the air without actually seeing him jitterbug around. Why don't you fellows take my tickets? There's a double bill on Greenwich Avenue with a monster and a mad doctor, and I think I'll go round and catch it. That's the only type of art I find nowadays that's able to hold my interest." "All right," agreed Cy, chuckling, as if our going would be a mischievous and priceless joke. I was curious enough to consent. Flagler paid for all our drinks. "Why not have another?" stuttered Cy. "You don't have to go right away, do you?" and immediately snapped his fingers for the waiter. I had an instinct to get away, but some spell that he exerted held me, and he had already given the order before I had had a chance to say no. Flagler handed me the broadcast tickets, pulled an old soft hat down over his eyes, thrust his hands into his overcoat pockets, and gazing straight ahead seemed to drive his round spectacles out the door like the headlights of some obsolete motor car. "Have you been doing any writing?" I asked Cy. "I've been doing some first lines of poems," he replied, with his quizzical glance. "Why just the first lines?" "Well, indexes of first lines of poems are sometimes absolutely amazing. They're better than the poems themselves. The other night I read the index of an anthology to some people, and they thought it was a great modern poem, which they didn't quite understand, but felt they ought to be impressed by. Would you like to hear the ones I've composed?" He took out of the side pocket of his coat a confused wad of soiled papers, which included the remnants of a small paper bag that had once contained peanuts. "I live on peanuts now," he said. "They're nutritious, they only cost a nickel, and they completely take the edge off your appetite. In fact, if you get through 2 bags, they make the idea of eating abhorrent. Let me read you these. They're not arranged yet in alphabetical order, the way they'd have to be for an index. I'm going to do that later when I've got some more." He read, and I was punctually appreciative. "The popo-nut thrower's paramour is pounded to pulp and rind. John is just a gimcrack to Mady. Beshrew me, wench, the monk is fair. If you put it on the market list, the past will come tomorrow. Stain it a gravy yellow, Ludlow. Old pale wild roses that poison the dawn. Province town, prison of poor little fish. The rain on the roof says, woof, woof. There are wombats in your belfry, Cousin Beastly. Bang me a missa solemnis. The bell-ringer's fingers were cold. The little hard bugs are back again. Say not of Amaryllis she is dull. Give us a rouse, landlord. The hunters have taken to hop. Dim veil, mid-veil, the omnipresent Puritan Perry. Fade low, fade slow, Papa has come a new cropper. Why don't you publish them, I suggested. Where, he asked, pleased by my laughter. If only I had Galimatius. I read them to Spike the other night, and they almost drove him crazy. What did he say? He was absolutely indignant because he thought I had wasted his time. He'd taken for granted that it was a book I was writing, that I wanted him to help me get published. He's got his schedule organized, you know, so that he's doing something definite every minute, and something that will bring in cash. He must make $60,000 or $70,000 a year. He told me that that kind of thing had been all right in the frivolous 20s, but that today it was the literary equivalent of vagrancy and disorderly conduct. He insinuated that it ought to be punishable by law. You know, the very mention of Finnegan's Wake makes him foam at the mouth. The idea that Joyce took 17 years to write it, when of course he might so easily have been doing something to prevent Pearl Harbor from happening. You remember that when Finnegan's Wake came out, Spike just dismissed it with a crack? I insisted on reading him parts of it one evening, and he actually began to sputter and gasp. You know how ordinarily he's never at a loss, how he can always rap out the right thing? He used to be a poet, I said. He must have known there was something in it. He's pretty jittery nowadays, I think. He's under such high pressure all the time, and I suppose he's all on tenterhooks just now about making his first appearance on television, afraid he won't be telegenic, as they call it. If they don't come out right, they're finished, just the way it was with the talkies when the actors who didn't have good voices found themselves thrown out of work overnight. He'd just be scrapped like an old-fashioned radio set, and now he must be lying awake nights worrying for fear his physique won't be able to live up to his voice. He's had to take off weight and go for a workout at the Yale Club every day, but I don't think he'll disappoint his fans. Think what a moment that's going to be when he first brushes a boyish hand through that shock of upstanding hair. Why, a vibration will run through the wavelengths that will make all the windows rattle. I paid for the drinks, but when the change came back, it was Cy who picked it up. He did this with a roguish and impudent look that made it impossible to reclaim the money. The look said, "That's the way I am. There's nothing you can do about it. It's like those crazy first lines of poems at which you've just been laughing so wildly." I had intended to take him to dinner at my club, in spite of his slightly hobo-ish appearance, but I now told him I had a dinner engagement and would meet him at the broadcasting studio. Yet I reflected, with a shade of compunction as I dined on clean linen alone, that the incorruptible line also incurred its price and brought its own kind of demoralization. That evening we sat, mute and immobilized, admonished not to make any sound, while Spike stood up against a gray screen under a blaze of a battery of banked Klieg lights that must have made a debut in television almost as much of an ordeal as a questioning by the New York police, put on the spot as he was, to prove himself viable in this medium, under pain of debarment from public appearance, by two monster-like cameras on trucks that glided backwards and forwards, converging on him with cyclopean lenses, and by a microphone suspended from a crane, like the antenna with its suspended bait of one of those gaping-mouthed anglerfish. He was not performing for us, poor Spike. We felt no direct relation with him. The radio had already dissociated the owner of the voice from its hearer, and now television was making it possible for men to stand in one another's presence without any of the immediate give and take that had always guaranteed in the past some basis of responsibility between human animal and human animal. Actually, Spike was before us grinning, sweeping his hand through his hair, timing his deadpan cracks, and holding up a copy of the novel. He was hardly aware of the New Yorkers there who had been invited to see him perform. He had been diminished and multiplied like the model for a colored advertisement, a clever little well-dressed homunculus that gestured and stepped about and wanted very much to please, while real life-size people were sitting around in their living rooms and watching him or looking away, getting up to search for a match or to answer the telephone, or were saying to one another, "He don't look as young as I expected," and while his amplified mechanical voice that came out of the apparatus and not from the lips of the shadow filled the room with its dark, hollow sound. In exploiting his personality, Spike Milholland had become quite depersonalized. He was a mere point of intersection by the great corporate lines of interest of the new television company, the several radio companies it had swallowed, a company that made powder for jelly desserts, and that was sponsoring this first big program, the great merger of publishing companies that was speculating on the Frederick Pratt novel, and the National Propaganda Bureau that had continued since the end of the war to work on public opinion at home as well as abroad. "In the winter of 1812, he began in the accurate and crackling way that had always picked up his radio audiences, the Russians drove out Napoleon, who had invaded their fatherland. 57 years later, Leo Tolstoy completed War and Peace, the epic of the liberation of Russia. It is now 167 years since the American Revolution, and up to the present it would have had to be said that the United States of America had as yet no national epic. I said up to the present, just now. I should have said up to this morning. Recently, our national density has carried us into Europe. We have been called by our national destiny," he snappily caught himself up, "to play an historic role in the Pacific and in Europe both. We have repelled not one, but two enemies, more menacing than Napoleon ever was. And we have rated at last today, I say it in all seriousness and in absolute confidence, our own American war and police." We could see that for one rocky moment he hesitated as to whether to correct himself, but he decided to sweep on with an energy that made him a little over-emphatic. "The name of Frederick Morse Pratt may not perhaps be familiar to all of you, but I am here to tell you tonight that my prediction is that by this time next year, the name of Frederick Trapp will be known—" He stopped, grinned, and called out his boyish charm. "My first appearance on television seems to be making me go up in my lines. I can't see you, but you can see me, and I'm feeling almost as nervous as if you were all sitting right here in front of me. Well, I was talking about Frederick Pratt. Who is he? He's an American writer who has learned the American way, a product of our American system, who has nourished himself on our bones and has our democracy in his. There I go again." He smiled briefly, but he could not conceal this time his anxiety and irritation. "What I want to say is that Fred Pratt is as American as hominy grits, as American as a soft-shell crab." He paused for the fraction of a moment as if this had not been the comparison he intended, but forged on. "His parents were poor, he had to drop school when he was 10, and he soon found himself adrift in a world, our American world, that makes a man prove his mettle, but that offers every man a chance. Fred Pratt worked as a movie usher, Mirage Gemanik." He pulled himself up again, but there seemed nothing for it but to plunge ahead. "He was a freight clerk and serta joker." "Joyce is having his revenge," burbled Cy in a voice that he tried to keep low, but which for me only tightened the strain. I was ominously reminded of the night when Warren had become incoherent, and also, as Spike went on, of the hysterical and unreal atmosphere which had been generated in Flagler's house by the delirium of the demented visitor the day before Jim Milholland had killed himself. "Well, Fred Pratt worked at anything and everything," Spike Milholland was going on, "and he saved up enough money to put himself through a year of college at Lehigh University. I'm not sure that Lehigh is a college, or rather, I'm not sure that I should say Lehigh University, but of course it's a very fine place, and Fred Pratt won a scholarship there, and he graduated a Phi Beta Kappa." In college, he had read Zane Grey, and he resolved to become a writer. And he obstinately plugged away, and he carried out this resolve. 10 years ago this month, while wiping weather reports for one of the big morning papers, he conceived a creative dream. He here made a long and terrible pause, but when he went on again, he seemed suddenly to have got rid of his constraint. He spoke readily and even recklessly, with a kind of glibness and arrogance that he had sometimes used on the air when tearing into some book that he wanted to discredit, and for a moment our attention was slackened till we caught up with the meaning of his words. That dream, he said, was Yale in China. It began with Dick Pratt of the class of '84 saying grace over a bowl of chop suey, and it ended with the expulsion from China of the competitive Japanese invader. And now, folks, I want to say a word about Gluco jelly desserts. Gluco, Cy afterwards explained to me, was not even the right brand. It was a dangerous rival of the jelly which Spike had been engaged to advertise. I don't believe that the Chinese coolie is getting his Gluco yet, but it is as certain that he is going to get it as that the Chinese people have been liberated by the American Army and Navy and by the United States Marines. No longer will the Chinese working man be forced to invite malnutrition diseases by subsisting on a meager dish of rice. He will sit down to a man's-size meal topped off with a dainty dessert, appetizing and health-building Gluco. There are 10 delicious flavors to choose from and special shades to flatter your complexion. A wonderful treat for baby, the thrill in a lifetime for sister, a great big kick for Dad, and for me, a sharp, throbbing pain in, you know, our favorite novelist. I thank you. They say the heat's terrific, said Cy as we were walking home after the show. It's like getting the 3rd degree. Sometimes they come out half dead. It sounded, I suggested, like some comic line that he might have worked up for a college smoker, with a flare-up of his radical ideas, which must have been rankling in his mind all the time. He can't be particularly pleased by the turn our foreign policy has taken. They would have cut him off the air, said Cy, long before he got to that point. Well, I wonder what the Milhollands will do to appease the old creditor now. It's between Spike and Warren, I guess. And I believe I'd bet on Spike. He's resourceful and quick, and he's streamlined himself to navigate the new age. He has youth and hope on his side. Yes, said Cy, but Warren's closer to the real American tradition. As Spike said, he's nourished on its bones. He has that Yankee tenacity and toughness that the younger generation lack. He's as shrewd as Benjamin Franklin and as hard-boiled as Andrew Jackson. He's succeeded in selling wooden nutmegs to the whole American reading public, whereas Spike's already gone to pieces and tried to give the show away. And even if the devil snares him, he may find he's only got a stuffed soul, and that Warren's still doing business above ground. Story number 6, Mr. and Mrs. Blackburn at Home. I kept thinking all through one summer that there was something about the American landscape which made you feel that it had just been discovered. This was true even in Hecate County, which was so full of gardened and arranged estates and of developed suburban roads. America. It suggests to us even now a landscape unfamiliar and wild. When I looked out over an inlet from the sea, I would feel, for all the white moored launches and the graded lawns on the opposite side, that we had sailed into some uncharted estuary and weighed anchor in some virgin harbor with its pale, opaque gray-blue waters, brackish and almost tepid, tranquilly rippled with evening. Its large birds, of which I did not know the names, flying slowly by the shore that had bred them, and its wooded and grassy banks that still seemed, though the houses had already been built, such a good place to build a house, to find at one's ready disposal all the best that a rich soil could afford, and not to be bothered by neighbors. There were adventures and new forms of life over there beyond the thick summer foliage. There were leisure, refreshment, romance. Even the sailboats against the gold sun seemed just to have alighted here, where there was nothing to prevent them from making themselves as easy and as much at home as the birds that were now, like them, becalmed in the long sweeping down of the ample, sure-bosomed night. Or I would step over a scrawling fence, a mere twist of old gray rails and barbed wire, and wade up through the unmowed grass into an isolated growth of forest that stood on a rise of ground above a swamp where I had gone as a child in March to see the hard, mottled helmets of the skunk cabbage butting up by the squashy hummocks. And I would find there a wilderness of big old trees amid the towering seed-tufted ailanthus, a snarl of blackberry bushes, and a matting underfoot of vines that made it rather forbidding in aspect and impossible to penetrate. Here the forces of vegetation were fiercely asserting themselves, and were quite able to keep a human at bay. Yet right along the edge of this wood were several acres completely cleared, with a white farmhouse and a neat plowed field. And for this family, enlivened by their radio and working the earth with the newest tools, the heavy creepers and thickets and branches still stood as a screen and a background, the old, uncouth, yet somehow comforting tangle of that one spot which had never been cut, and that still kept the mysterious solitude, the inexhaustible recesses and shadows of a land where we were still frontiersmen. One was brought to a peculiar consciousness of what it meant to be at home in America, to feel the reassurance of America, and yet at the same time to savor the locust trees and wild grapes in the air as they had reached the first navigators during the years after the accession of Hitler, when the exiles from Europe were arriving. These had come to us not from curiosity, not from the need for a simpler society, but merely because pressures at home had forced them to take up residence elsewhere, and they would try to go on living in the United States exactly as if they were still in Europe. Where their surroundings in America did not give them the nourishment, the support, and the responses that they had been used to having at home, they complained, or they silently suffered. But they rarely made any attempt, many of them, of course, were too old, to understand the country they had fled to. The least adaptable were the French and the Germans, the most flexible the Austrians and the Russians. But neither class displayed very much interest in finding out what America meant. The Germans, whether young radical political workers or elderly and scholastic doctors, were always obsessed by programs or projects of which the desirability seemed to them self-evident, and would attempt to drive them through under conditions which they had not applied themselves to studying, among a people whom they hardly knew, with a complacency and a determination which seemed to us almost insane, but which did something to make Hitler comprehensible. The French, of course, behaved very differently, but they maintained their cautious bourgeois habits, or promoted their aesthetic movements as if they were still in Parisian intérieur, that word that so excludes the outdoors. The surrealists would discover the Indian Katsinas or the statues on Easter Island. Ah, vous savez, c'est formidable, c'est le vrai art américain que les Américains ne connaissaient pas. But they could never bring these into focus with their own synthetic grotesques, which had been made to be seen only in galleries. The Viennese learned at once all the tricks of their trades and all the right tones to take with people, but confident in the exercise of their subtlety on what seemed to them the crudeness of the Americans, just as they had been with the Germans, they remained on the outside in America just as they had been with Germany. The Russian case was a little different. The Russian émigré intellectuals had brought to the United States, as they had done to Western Europe, a gift of idiom and a ready intelligence, as well as something of a more general capacity for natural human relations that one did not find in the people from countries more constricted and more crampingly stratified. And with their incomparable theatrical sense, they acted the part of guest more brilliantly. But with their inveterate snobbishness toward Europe, they tended to regard the Americans, perhaps too much like themselves, as a provincial and uninteresting race, whose principal role, after all, was to provide a fairly comfortable refuge for accomplished cosmopolitan Russians. Only the English, that odd migration which had given up England on the eve of the war and gravely, without explanation, had established themselves in the United States, only the English sometimes took the trouble to look into American history and to inform themselves on modern America, rather as if it were a department of their colonial activity that they had always meant to get up, and which they required only a bit of reading to master and to set us right about. We, on our side, were able to profit, for we had specimens often very distinguished of all the principal European nationalities to examine and converse with at leisure on our own ground and in our own light, apparently unaware, the exiles, of their educative value for us, who, not without a certain surprise, the pioneers' final surprise at discovering that a traditionless country has cast them in a definite mold, were finding our national strength in the course of such contacts and comparisons at home, as well as through our effectiveness abroad with the mechanical engineering of modern war. Thus, we were stimulated, in a sense, by the refugees even when they let us down. And it was but rarely that we found them fatiguing or were annoyed, after long conversations, at becoming aware that we were framing our thoughts in foreign phrases, or an inverted word order, as if instead of talking English to the visitors, we had been trying to make ourselves understood abroad. One house there was, notably, however, which used sometimes to affect me in this way without my ever being able to determine of what nationality the inmates were. They were not refugees from Hitler, for they had been living in the United States from the early 20s at least, and when I found the place one weekend full of Italian professors and editors, who called the host Mr. Malatesta, I assumed that he was an exiled anti-fascist. But I later found it full of Russians, who referred to him as Mr. Chernokhvostov, and I was told by a clever Russian novelist who seemed to have known him in Europe, but whom I did not necessarily believe, that he was a fur dealer who traded with the Soviets, that he belonged to an old Moscow merchant family and had left after the revolution, and that his name had to do with the skins of some kind of Siberian animal on which the family fortune had been based. On another occasion I heard him called Schwarzkopf by a theatrical director from Berlin, but I took it for German banter, a joke about his swarthy complexion. With us, the name he went by was Blackburn, and there were moments when his hawk-like profile and his sly and homely manner made me think him a typical Yankee, a Yankee, if that were possible, with a touch of colored blood. But his appearance, his accent, and his manner seemed to vary in a curious fashion, so that one never carried away after seeing him a clear impression of what he was like. One Sunday, when a Soviet official was there, I absolutely had the illusion that Ed Blackburn had 3 gold front teeth, and with the agents of big German companies, he spoke German as emphatically as they did, and showed the same bullying gallantry with their ladies. In any case, we went to his parties, which were sometimes small dinners on weekends, at which we would meet his guests, sometimes enormous evening blowouts to which everybody in the neighborhood was invited. His house was a gigantic affair on top of a moderate-sized hill, with many stables and graveled drives, bowling alleys, greenhouses, and wire-fenced fields, not all of which, however, were now kept up. No doubt he had got the place cheap because it was the kind of thing nobody wanted. The house was a great mound of red brick which a traction magnet had amassed sometime in the early 1900s, and it combined the many rows of windows of an old-fashioned summer hotel with the square hardness of a new garage. There was a corrugated green copper roof that used to glare in the August sun and make the whole place look uncomfortable and public, like the factories and the railroad stations, the business blocks and the municipal buildings among which the streetcars of the owner had crawled and scraped and screamed. They couldn't bother themselves in those days, Ed Blackburn would say with a laugh, as if the arrogance and crassness of the industrial millionaires gave him some sort of sardonic satisfaction about the mere aesthetic aspects of life. They were too busy making people cough up, if you will pardon my using the idiom of that period, to care what they gave them to look at. That summer, in '34, when I had been feeling the freshness of our landscape and meeting the émigrés, though all those that I have mentioned above had not yet, of course, come over, I drove up to the Blackburns one night for one of their periodical routs. I was glad of the chance to go out, because in the last few days I had been coming to clutch at pretexts for evading an internal strain. It was a question of whether or not I ought finally to marry Jo. It was now a little less than a week before she would have to go out to the coast to do her 6 months of the year with her children, and our relations were now at the point, after a love affair that had lasted 6 years, where it seemed the inevitable thing for us to marry and live together. It was hard on her, I knew, to have to leave me for so long a time every year, but on the other hand, it was difficult for me to go out to California with her. Her former husband had made it impossible for her to bring her children east. It would mean giving up my job, and I had feared that my meager income would not be equal to her standard of living out there. Besides, she did bore me a little if I had to be alone with her too long. I could not talk to her very much about painting. As a child, she had been taken to Europe, and she had collected picture postcards of great paintings, which she still preserved in an album. But in spite of my efforts to instruct her, I was never able to see that her interest had progressed very much beyond this. Nor did I fit into her world very well. She had become more and more addicted to a migratory cocktail set who were mostly far too rich for me, and by the 30s had come to disgust me. I could not imagine myself spending, as she did, evening after evening with them, nor was I able to imagine her, though she assured me she would like nothing better, drinking quietly with a book every night, while I shut myself up in my study. The old arrangement had had the advantage for me that it had combined a dependable girl, available half the year, and never left on my hands too long, with 6 months of entire freedom. Though I was sometimes disorganized when she went, at finding myself without resources, or annoyed by inferior entanglements which I should not have let myself in for if Jo had been there. But she had several admirers on the coast, and there was one that she had thought seriously of marrying, and it was unfair for me to prevent her from doing so if I did not want to marry her myself. Or was I afraid that she would decide before I was ready to let her go? In any case, the moment had come. After all, if I gave up my job, I should have to finish my book, and as she had just inherited securities, which, even on a shrunken market, would bring her $10,000 a year, and a house in Pasadena with a patio that had belonged to her late uncle, I should not have to worry about living if I did not mind living on her. But what worried me now was to know whether the prospect of leisure and a house of our own was tempting me to do something that it was wrong for me to do, or whether, on the contrary, the fear of being influenced by practical considerations was inhibiting me from doing the right thing. I kept putting off the decision, and was becoming self-conscious with her because I felt that she expected me to speak, to release her, or to ask her to marry me. And instead of coming to grips with the problem, I found myself seeking out people and applying myself to tasks as if I were hoping that these contacts with the world would somehow make everything clear. As I approached the crisis ahead, I continually became more methodical, more deliberate, more even-tempered. I was managing thus to defer whatever I should have to feel when I had chosen one course or the other. So I welcomed the affair at the Blackburns, and I greeted Ed Blackburn with heartiness when he happened to come out into the hall, just at the moment when I had entered the door, and before I had joined the party. He looked quite fine in his stiff white shirt, full black trousers, and jaunty dinner jacket, which he always wore, even on occasions when most people no longer dressed. And it was only when he came up and shook hands with me that I noticed how somber and haggard he looked. The skin hanging loose from the aggressive jaw, the creases deepened from the dark bristling nostrils, and the round shutters of the eyelids drooping over eyes that, especially now, had some tinge of the Oriental. I felt more than ever, in meeting him tonight, that he was not really a part of our community, and I was aware of a curious impression that he did not grow old as we did, but belonged to some remote time and place toward which, in spite of his well-tailored evening clothes, he was now rather wearily reverting. But he grasped my hand so vigorously with both of his, and flashed me such a live, black-eyed smile that I found he had become with the years an old friend as well as a neighbor, and a comfortable part of my life. "Hello!" he exclaimed. "I was hoping you'd come. I've just read your very brilliant article. I know that it's been out for months, but one gets so little time for such things. I hope you won't think I'm trying to flatter you when I tell you that it's given me more to think about than anything I've read about painting since 10. You have, if you'll pardon my saying so, a sense of the historical background and an aesthetic appreciation that one very rarely finds together. The historians are not artists, and the aesthetes do not see the world in terms of time and space, isn't it so?" "There are some very good art critics," I said, "who are not historically minded." "But such critics are insufficient," he insisted. "It's not enough to have an orgasm over beauty. We must be able to understand why the athlete cut in stone, the Periclean Greek with every muscle perfectly developed, is different from the emaciated, elongated saint of the Greek that we call El Greco. And it seems to me that you've formulated some general truths that give the clue to these historical differences in a way that is absolutely masterly. I know that it is stupid of me to be reading you only now, when you have been writing for so long a time, but really, your article has supplied me with the answers to many questions that have always puzzled me." It seemed to me that his way of phrasing was more than usually foreign tonight, that he had almost an un-English accent. And in spite of what was perhaps a slight coarseness in his perception of the problems with which I had dealt, I was pleased that a European should have found something new in my article. "Don't go in right away," he continued as I was moving toward the door of the big living room. "Once you're in there with that jabbering crowd, conversation will become impossible. You would be doing me a real favor if you would come into the library for a chat." He led the way through a great enclosed court full of fragments of Roman marbles, and an immense display of hothouse flowers. I lingered a moment to look, and he explained what I already knew, that the traction millionaire and his wife had always had these flowers on show here, and that he, Blackburn, had kept up the custom, employing the same staff of gardeners. The flowers had to be changed every week, and carrying on the same expensive program, which involved always producing special things that would normally be out of season. This seemed to me rather perverse, because the effect of these bouquets and potted plants was almost invariably hideous. They were at once exotic and vulgar. Just at present, since it was early in the summer, the flowers were mostly of species appropriate to early winter. The main element in the pattern was chrysanthemums, tousled balls of maroon and white, egg yolk yellow and washed-out mauve, frizzy, withering pale yellow puffs and rusty reddish-orange blobs, pink rosettes with round, bug-eyed centers, and drooping pinwheels of white shredded coconut. Remembering this flower as the feminine emblem of the big college football games, I was rather surprised to see that they could be made to look so unattractive. And among the various objects of antiquity, the stone fruit baskets and garlanded sarcophagi, the scattering of slender plinths that had no longer any function in a building, but were set about in utter futility, and the pedestaled torsos and busts so featureless, maimed and gray that one felt they might have been better left buried, the gaping dolphins with twisted tails dripping water into a chipped stone fountain. Among these were set waxen begonias as dry as pink potato chips, anthurium with slim phallic fingers sticking out from flesh-pink elephant ears, potted palms that seemed exasperatingly irrelevant, and jungle-sized rubber plants growing clumsily and sagging over, and varied Brazilian orchids that, purple, pale green, or brown, streamered, snouted, frilled, and lipped, looked now too much like artificial ornaments, now too much like self-contained goblins to be pleasantly acceptable as flowers, and that had ugly and wrong-sounding names like Lycnus Miranda magrevii gigas, and Brasilianus Lycus zygopetalum herniae. "A perfect period piece, isn't it?" said Blackburn. "The bad taste of the early 1900s, which surpasses any other bad taste, especially in the United States. I've thought it was worth preserving. And when you consider that all these outlandish growths were bought at the expense of the public, by making the passengers on streetcars pay extra nickels and pennies over and above the reasonable fares, where the few cents difference meant food and coal, he chuckled. Not tops in its line, but by no means to be scorned, nevertheless. A Renaissance prince, if you like, would have invested in something more seductive. Here the mask is completely distasteful as the sin was essentially mean. And with only a small slice of that fortune, provided one has civilized taste, how delightfully one could always have lived. A courtyard, for example, can be charming. It can provide an aesthetic center in the general composition of a house, though it's better in a sunnier climate, where one does not have to have it roofed in. I thought about the patio that Jo had described in her aunt's Pasadena house with wicker furniture and clay zuni pots,